What does it take to kill the leader of an entire nation, along with almost his whole command structure, in under 60 seconds? And what happens to a country when it has to do that twice? If you have ever wondered how close the modern world has come to watching a government simply stop existing overnight, stay with me, because this story will change how you think about power. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now, not because I am asking nicely, but because what you are about to hear is the kind of story people usually only read about weeks later in half-finished pieces. You are getting the full picture today. Tap like if you want more of this, and send this to one person who still thinks wars are fought only on battlefields, because this one was fought inside bedrooms, offices, and family homes. On the night of February 28th, 2026, something happened in Tehran that most military historians will spend years trying to fully explain. Israeli and American aircraft struck the residential compound of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, while he was reportedly with members of his inner circle. Within the opening minute of that operation, dozens of Iran's most senior military and security officials were dead. Khamenei himself did not survive. Iranian state media confirmed his death days later, after initial denials, and announced 40 days of national mourning. He was 86 years old, and he had led the Islamic Republic since 1989. In one strike, one of the longest-standing rulers on the planet was gone. Now, sit with that for a second. This was not a leader killed while traveling, or caught in an ambush on the road, or taken out during a rare public appearance. This was a strike on his own residence, timed to catch him together with the people who ran his military, his intelligence services, and his nuclear program. To pull that off, you don't just need firepower. You need to know in advance exactly who would be in that room, at that hour, on that night. That is not luck. That is months, maybe years, of quiet intelligence work finally being cashed in all at once. And the human cost went far beyond the supreme leader himself. Iranian officials confirmed that Khamenei's daughter, his son-in-law, and his young grandchild were killed in the very same strike. Whatever this operation was meant to accomplish strategically, it did not stop at military targets. It reached directly into a family's home. Now, let's talk about who else didn't make it through that first minute, because the list reads less like a random group of casualties and more like a checklist of an entire government being switched off at once. Mohammad Pakpour, commander-in-chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, was killed. Iran's defense minister, Aziz Nasirzadeh, was killed. The chief of staff of the armed forces, Abdulrahim Mousavi, was killed. Ali Khamenei, a longtime security advisor and secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, was killed as well. These were not junior officers. These were the people who, on any ordinary day, would have been the ones deciding how Iran responded to an attack like this. Instead, they became part of the attack's outcome. Beneath those names, the strike kept cutting deeper. Saleh Assadi, the head of intelligence at Iran's Central Wartime Command Headquarters, was killed. A senior Air Force general in charge of logistics and support for the entire armed forces was killed. A brigadier general who had spent years running operations planning for the military's general staff was killed. The commander of Iran's police intelligence organization, the body responsible for domestic surveillance and internal security, was killed too. Layer by layer, in the space of one night, Iran lost the people who ran its army, its internal police intelligence, its wartime command center, and its National Security Council, almost all at the same moment. Here's what makes this so different from a normal battlefield loss. Countries like Iran build their power structures specifically to survive this kind of shock. Authoritarian states tend to run overlapping, competing branches of security and military command on purpose. It's not inefficiency, it's a defense mechanism. If one general tries to seize too much power, another rival branch is there to check him. If one agency turns against the government, 3 others are watching it happen and ready to respond. It's a system built to survive betrayal from within. What it was never built to survive is an outside force with intelligence so precise that it can find every single one of those competing branches in one location at one moment and remove all of them together. The very structure meant to protect the regime from itself offered almost no protection against a single, well-planned night from the outside. There was one more name connected to that first wave that deserves real attention because his story took an unexpected turn. Iranian outlets initially reported that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran's former president, had been killed when a strike hit his residence in Tehran. For a short time, most of the world believed the headline. but later reporting told a more complicated story. According to accounts that followed, the strike near his home killed several of his bodyguards, but Ahmadinejad himself survived, and in the chaos that followed, he reportedly slipped free of the government restrictions that had been placed on his movements for months. He wasn't dead. He was, in a strange twist, more free than he had been in years, his location unknown even to the regime that used to keep watch on him. Think about what that detail tells you about how much control the Iranian government still had that night. If a former president, someone the state had been actively restricting, could vanish off the map during the chaos, it says something about how completely the system had been shaken. Now, if this had been the end of the story, it would already be one of the most significant single nights in modern military history. But it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something longer and stranger, a pattern that would repeat itself again within weeks. Before we go further into what happened next, let me ask you something. If you have made it this far, you already understand this is not a story you'll get the full picture of anywhere else. So do me a favor, drop a comment with the number 40 right now, just so I know you're still with me, because the next part of this story is where it gets almost impossible to believe. In the days after Khamenei's death, Iran needed someone to hold the country together. That role fell to Ali Larijani. He was not some unknown figure suddenly thrust into power. Larijani had been one of the most recognizable names in Iranian politics for decades, a former Speaker of Parliament, a repeat presidential candidate, and by the time the war began, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. He had reportedly been trusted by Khamenei himself in the period before his death, with planning how the Islamic Republic would survive if its leadership was ever wiped out. In other words, Larijani was Iran's answer to the exact catastrophe that had just happened. He became the country's de facto wartime leader, coordinating its military and political response while the rest of the government tried to regroup. He lasted 17 days. On the night between March 16th and March 17th, 2026, Israeli aircraft struck again, and this time, Larijani was the target. According to reporting from multiple outlets, he was killed while visiting his daughter's home in a district east of Tehran. Israel's defense minister confirmed the strike publicly. Iranian state media confirmed his death shortly after. He was 67 years old. Let that timeline sink in for a moment. Iran lost its actual head of state on February 28th. It lost the man specifically prepared to hold the country together in that exact scenario less than 3 weeks later. That is not one bad night for a government. That is losing your entire chain of command twice in under a month, with the second loss hitting the one person who was supposed to be the contingency plan for the first. Killed in that same operation was Gholamreza Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Basij paramilitary force, the volunteer militia network responsible for a huge amount of the regime's internal control and mobilization. So in a single strike, Iran didn't just lose its top security official, it also lost the man running one of its largest domestic paramilitary forces on the very same night. Now here's a detail that puts real weight behind how this kept happening. According to reporting from Iran International, tips from residents in Tehran are believed to have helped enable the strike that found Larijani. Whatever operational security Iran tried to build around its most senior surviving official after Khamenei's death, it wasn't enough. Whether through intercepted communications, informants, or sheer pattern recognition, Israeli and American intelligence services appeared able to locate Iran's replacement leadership just as effectively as they had located the original. And this wasn't even the first time in this broader conflict that Iran had lost senior commanders this way. Back in the summer of 2025, during what became known as the 12-Day War, Israeli strikes on Tehran had already killed a wave of senior figures, including the IRGC's commander-in-chief at the time, Hossein Salami, along with other senior commanders overseeing missile and aerospace operations. Those roles had to be refilled in the months that followed. New commanders stepped into those same positions. And then, in February 2026, several of those replacements were killed too. This is a war that has now shown on more than one occasion that it can reach whoever sits in a specific chair of power, no matter how many times that chair changes hands. Think about what that actually does to a military organization. Most armies plan their leadership succession over years, sometimes decades, deliberately grooming officers through a long career ladder so institutional knowledge and trust get passed down gradually. What happened to Iran's command structure was the opposite of that. It had to rebuild its top leadership almost from scratch, under intense wartime pressure, not once, but at least twice within less than a year. The people stepping into those roles the second time around didn't have years to build relationships with the units under them or earn the kind of trust their predecessors had. They inherited enormous responsibility overnight, in the middle of an active war, with a target already effectively on their position before they even had time to settle into it. If you're finding this as unbelievable as I did when I first put this timeline together, do me a quick favor, smash that like button, not for me, but so this video reaches more people who need to actually understand what happened here, because most coverage out there barely connects these dots. In the days right after Larijani's death, the pattern didn't slow down. On March 20th, Israeli strikes killed Ali Khamenei, who had served as the spokesperson for the IRGC since 2024. His job wasn't commanding troops. It was managing the regime's public voice, appearing on television, delivering warnings, shaping how tens of millions of Iranians understood the war they were living through. He had survived the Iran-Iraq War decades earlier as a young man, only to die in this one at 69 years old. Killing a spokesperson might sound less significant than killing a general, but think about what it actually removes. It takes out the person controlling the psychological and informational side of the war, the face and voice that shapes public morale during the most uncertain moments of a nation's history. Alongside him, according to reporting on that same window of strikes, Iran lost the intelligence chief of the Basij paramilitary organization and a senior commander inside the Ministry of Intelligence. In the span of less than a single week, Iran had lost its de facto national leader, the commander of its largest domestic paramilitary force, the IRGC's public spokesperson, and senior figures inside two separate intelligence services. 5 different institutional pillars, gone within 7 days of each other. Analysts who study this kind of warfare, including researchers at the Critical Threats Project, assessed that these repeated strikes on Iran's internal security services likely caused confusion and disruption within the country's security apparatus. That's a carefully worded professional conclusion, but when you lay the names out next to each other the way we just did, it's hard to reach any other conclusion yourself. Here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about all of this. It would be easy to look at the number 40 and think that's the whole story. One dramatic night, one tragic but contained event. But that number was never the full picture. It was the opening chapter of something that kept regenerating and kept getting cut down again. The original leadership in June 2025, a second generation of commanders wiped out in February 2026, alongside the supreme leader himself. A hand-picked successor and his own paramilitary command structure eliminated less than 3 weeks after that. A public spokesperson and internal intelligence figures gone within days of that. This is not one moment. This is a sustained campaign spread across 9 months, built on the working assumption that killing the current leadership would never be enough on its own, because whoever stepped up to replace them would need to be found and removed too. Eventually, Iran's leadership structure did stabilize, at least on paper. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain supreme leader, rose to become his father's successor in the aftermath of this entire chain of events. Think about the symbolism of that outcome for a moment. A government that prided itself on decades of institutional continuity, that had built layers upon layers of overlapping command specifically to prevent any single point of collapse, ultimately had power settle within one family, because so much of the structure meant to manage that succession in an orderly way had simply been removed from the board. What this timeline really shows us is something bigger than any single number. It shows how fragile even the most heavily fortified power structures can be when intelligence penetration reaches a certain level. It shows that redundancy built to survive an internal rival is not the same thing as redundancy built to survive an external power that can see everything at once. And it shows that in modern warfare, killing a leader is often not the end of a story. It's the start of a much longer hunt for whoever tries to stand in that leader's place next. If you've stayed with me this far, you now understand this story better than most people who only skimmed a headline back in February or March. You understand that 40 deaths in 1 minute was never really about the number 40. It was about a country that lost its government not once, but again and again, faster than it could ever finish rebuilding it. Before you go, I want you to think about the question I asked you at the very start. How many times does a nation have to lose its leadership before we stop calling it a single event and start calling it something else entirely? If this story left you with as many questions as it left me, let me know in the comments what part of this timeline shocked you the most. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive like this one, and share it with someone who still thinks they already know the full story of what happened in Iran in 2026.